Welcome to the monthly lecture at the IWM, the Institute for Human Sciences. This evening we are extremely pleased to present one of our current and most distinguished senior fellows here at the IWM, ROGERS Brubaker. ROGERS is Professor of Sociology and UCLA Foundation Chair at the University of California, LA. Many of you here may know him from his work on nationalism, particularly in France, Germany, Central and Eastern Europe during the 1990s. But more recently, ROGERS has been focusing on the issues of communication, political and social discourse in the digital age, which is what he will be addressing this evening. And having read the lecture, I can tell you that, well, in my humble estimation, you will not be disappointed by what he has to say. I found it extremely illuminating. After the lecture, which will last somewhere between 45 and 55 minutes, I will ask him a couple of questions, and then we'll throw it open to the floor before winding up on the half hour so that we can all repair to the canteen downstairs for our wine and cheese. So please join us if you're able to. But without further ado, I will ask ROGERS to take the floor and give us the lecture.
Thank you so much, Misha, for the kind words of introduction, and thank you all for coming this evening. For at least 30 years, from the 1980s through the middle of the last decade, digital connectivity seemed to be full of democratic promise. It ushered in a fundamental shift in the ecology of public communication, which was characterized by Manuel Castells as a shift from unidirectional mass communication to multi-directional, what Castells called mass self-communication. This new ecology of communication, it was thought, would promote more participatory forms of citizenship. It would bring previously excluded or marginalized groups into the polity, and it would contribute to undermining authoritarian regimes. Now, the story got many elements right. Citizenship has indeed become more participatory, as ordinary citizens have joined public conversations in new ways and in unprecedented numbers. Social media and messaging apps, by facilitating lateral communication and lowering the cost of coordination, have enabled new forms of what has been called connective action and fostered new kinds of horizontal social movements. They've made it easier for previously marginalized groups to be seen and heard, and new forms of bottom-up surveillance enabled by the ubiquity of mobile, connected cameras have made certain forms of speech and action by powerful individuals and public authorities more visible and more accountable. Yet the opportunistic narrative got other things badly wrong. Instead of making politics more transparent, hyperconnectivity has fragmented the public sphere and made politics more opaque. Non-transparent micro-targeting practices, guided by sophisticated behavioral science, have migrated from the realm of commerce to that of politics. Opaque and proprietary algorithms determine who sees what, and private platforms regulate who can say what. Both developments contribute to privatizing the public sphere. Encrypted messenger services have allowed political campaigns, especially in the developing world, to spread rumors and mobilize fear while avoiding public accountability. So since the middle of the last decade, the digital dream of renewing democratic citizenship has been challenged and partly overshadowed by a digital nightmare of undermining democratic citizenship by short-circuiting reasoned deliberation, nurturing conspiracy theories, intensifying polarization, and incubating extremism. And authoritarian regimes, even if they were indeed initially unprepared for the nimbleness and creativity of digitally mediated opposition movements, have long since learned to monitor and counter such movements. And the most sophisticated such regimes, led by China, have entrenched their power through massively enhanced capacities for digital surveillance. So digital nightmares can be just as seductive and just as distorting as digital dreams. So I want to resist the temptation to replace digital boosterism with digital doomsterism, and the temptation to blame hyperconnectivity and social media in particular for all contemporary political ills. It's not that I want to offer a more optimistic account. Far from it, but I do want to provide a more differentiated account by considering transformations of what I will call regimes of knowing, regimes of feeling, and regimes of governing. By regimes of knowing, I mean the ways people acquire politically relevant knowledge, or what they take to be knowledge, and the stances that they take towards public knowledge claims. I'll argue that hyperconnectivity strengthens populist stances towards knowledge and erodes the foundations of a shared public world. By regimes of feeling, I mean the ways feelings are patterned by socio-technical environments and governed by feeling rules, to borrow Arlie Hochschild's phrase, that legitimate certain ways of expressing feeling. I will argue that hyperconnectivity encourages and rewards the mobilization and expression of moral outrage, and thereby contributes to what political scientists have called affective polarization. And by regimes of governing, I mean the new modalities of algorithmic governance that are based on machine learning. I will argue that algorithmic governance has transformed the exercise of power by public agencies and, even more importantly, by private platforms, not least by enabling the fully automated exercise of power. I'll conclude by considering the tension between these technocratic modes of governance and the more populist regimes of knowing and feeling fostered by hyperconnectivity. So I'll start with regimes of knowing. Epistemic issues have become increasingly central to the study of politics in recent years. By epistemic issues, I mean concerns about truth and falsehood, about science and expertise, about misinformation and conspiracy theories. But such issues have also become increasingly central to political debates and struggles themselves. Claims have proliferated about fake news, about what science tells us, about what the experts got wrong. So political struggles concern not just who gets what, or who is what, but who knows what, or who believes what. So the politics of interest and the politics of identity are increasingly bound up with the politics of knowledge. The emerging regime of hyperconnectivity initially inspired epistemic optimism. It encouraged people to think of politically relevant knowledge, as of knowledge in general, in terms of discrete bits of information. So information would be abundant, easily discoverable, universally accessible, and the flow of information would be lateral, not simply vertical. Citizens would be empowered to produce and disseminate, as well as to consume information. And this free flow of information would make politics more transparent, citizens better informed, and governments more responsive. Now, even as this view came to seem hopelessly naive, the focus on discrete bits of information remained. Only now, the emphasis was on the abundant and unimpeded flow of misinformation. Discussions of misinformation intensified during the pandemic and reached a fever pitch in the aftermath of the 2020 American election. But I want to address a different question. That is, how the ecology of digital hyperconnectivity has reshaped ways of knowing the public world by reinforcing suspicion and distrust and eroding the foundations of a shared public world. I want to emphasize that hyperconnectivity is not solely or even primarily responsible for these developments. The decline of deference, the suspicion of expert judgment, the valorization of lay expertise, these all have a long history, but digital hyperconnectivity has intensified and accelerated these developments. I want to highlight three features of the epistemic environment of hyperconnectivity that I want to call abundance, flatness, and immediacy. By abundance, I mean not only the abundance of information or misinformation, but also the abundance of conflicting knowledge claims. By flatness, I mean that knowledge claims of the most varied provenance, unfiltered by gatekeepers, jostle side by side for our attention and assent on what feels like, or what can feel like, a relatively unstructured and level playing field. Now, of course, the digital public sphere is not a level playing field. There are enormous differences in the ability to make one's voice heard. But the openness of the digital environment means that all knowledge claims, along with all other digital content, flow through the same conduits and circulate in the same decontextualized manner. And this exerts a homogenizing, leveling effect. It places the wildest and most implausible claims on the same plane and in the same frame as those generated by established institutions. And by immediacy, finally, I mean the sense of having institutionally unmediated, direct access to information. Though again, of course, access to information is not, in fact, unmediated, but rather mediated in a new way, algorithmically mediated. So abundance alters not just what we know, but how we know it, or how we think we know it. So it alters our relation or our stance toward knowledge claims by exposing us continuously to a welter of conflicting knowledge claims, claims that in a flat knowledge space may appear to be on the same plane. Digital abundance tends to inculcate a stance of generalized doubt, suspicion, and distrust. It thereby contributes to weakening the authority of the institutions that produce and disseminate public knowledge, journalism in particular. And this mood of heightened distrust can engender then a generalized skepticism toward public knowledge claims. Abundance can also be wielded as a weapon. In a flat knowledge space, and in the absence of trusted intermediaries, abundance can be enlisted as a deliberate strategy of distraction and obfuscation. It can be a means of producing resignation, cynicism, and a sense of disempowerment, as Zeynep Tufekci has argued. The instrumentalization of abundance need not even aim to persuade. It may aim simply to overwhelm. Steve Bannon's famous dictum that the way to deal with the media is to, quote, flood the zone with shit, epitomizes this strategy. The result may be a paralyzing, demobilizing sense, here I quote Tufekci again, that the truth is simply unknowable. But epistemic distrust is uneven. Distrust in traditional, institutionalized media may go hand in hand with trust in less institutionalized sources of knowledge or in alternative epistemic communities. In an environment of seemingly immediate access to information and knowledge, abundance can heighten confidence in individuals' own judgment, including their judgment about which public knowledge claims to trust. And so it can contribute to what has been called epistemic hubris, that is, to unwarranted confidence in one's own beliefs about policy-related matters. So what I'm arguing is that the sense of immediacy can work against the disorienting effects of abundance and flatness. Individuals may feel that they enjoy immediate access not only to an abundance of information, but to an abundance of evidence or proof that they may understand as validating or invalidating particular public knowledge claims. So abundance in connection with immediacy can be polarizing rather than paralyzing. It can produce contending certainties as those who already hold strong views hew to them even more strongly, seeing their own views as abundantly confirmed and opposing views as abundantly discredited. So both effects of abundance, paralyzing and demobilizing on the one hand, polarizing on the other, were amply evident during the pandemic. Hyperconnectivity has made it much easier for us to inhabit radically different public worlds. The public worlds that we inhabit are constituted in significant part by what we know or believe about them. And what we have known or believed about COVID-19, for example, not only about what should be done, but about the most basic descriptive facts, has been radically discrepant. Sharp disagreements about how to define and make sense of the pandemic would no doubt have flourished even in a less connected information ecosystem, but polarization in what people claim to know or believe about the public world has been deepened and democratized by hyperconnectivity. The flood of hyper-accessible evidence and the ease of sharing it and discussing it have made polarization, in a sense, more participatory. Again, fragmentation of the public world is not new. If mid-20th century systems of mass communication supported a widely shared public world, the binding power of that world had been weakened long before hyperconnectivity, notably in the US by the proliferation of talk radio and cable news channels. But the proliferation of rival, epistemic, moral, and political worlds has been carried much further in this environment of digital hyperconnectivity. The abundance, structural flatness, and anti-institutional immediacy of the digital environment have strengthened both epistemic individualism and epistemic populism. They've strengthened individualism by seemingly making it easier to think for oneself, or, quote, do the research, as the saying goes in conspiratorial milieu. They have strengthened epistemic populism by heightening skepticism of the complex and opaque workings of mainstream knowledge-producing institutions, and increasing access to and interest in forms of counter-knowledge that challenge established bodies of knowledge. In both ways, hyperconnectivity has further undermined the cultural authority and deference once enjoyed by mainstream knowledge-producing and knowledge-disseminating institutions. In so doing, it has contributed to this proliferation of competing public worlds, and more specifically, it has provided a robust infrastructure for such worlds, an infrastructure that facilitates the production and circulation of a seemingly limitless supply of engaging, compelling, world-sustaining content. Digital media have often been blamed for contributing to so-called post-truth politics, but the contemporary digital environment encourages not the abandonment, but the proliferation of truth claims. It facilitates the multiplication of digitally mediated subcultures that may develop into cultures in the strong sense, committed, as Michael Sokassis puts it, not just to alternative moral orders, but to alternative realities. The radically discrepant perspectives on public phenomena thus generated are not just differences of interpretation, they are differences about the most basic facts. So the upshot for Sokassis is that we are all conspiracy theorists now, in the sense that we all hold certain beliefs that many others consider, and I quote, not just mistaken, but preposterous and paranoid. One additional feature of the knowledge environment of hyperconnectivity has become particularly pronounced in the last couple of years. This is, of course, the power of generative AI to create extremely convincing synthetic images, text, audio, video. The ability to make up textual, audio, and visual evidence cheaply, easily, convincingly will substantially undermine of course, the integrity of digital evidence. And this can only further aggravate the forms of epistemic disarray that I have described. And as such generative models improve further, the texts that they produce will be increasingly difficult to distinguish from texts written by humans, and the existing difficulty of distinguishing bot-generated from human tweets and short social media posts will extend to longer form writing. Propaganda will be largely automated and therefore much cheaper, as well as much harder to trace. Many platforms are likely to respond by limiting posts to accounts with verified identities. This may be indispensable, but it will further increase platform control over public discourse, a theme I will return to later. So I turn now to transformations of regimes of feeling. Just as Hyperconnectivity initially inspired epistemic optimism, so too, under the influence of the Arab Spring and the Occupy movements, it inspired optimism about the mobilization of feeling. Manuel Castell's hopeful account of the horizontal and participatory social movements enabled by digital networks pivoted on the mobilization of feeling. So did Zizi Papakarisi's equally hopeful account of affective publics, which focused on processes of what she called affective attunement on Twitter that allow people to feel their way into developing stories. Since the middle of the last decade, however, hyperconnectivity has come to be associated with strong negative emotions, especially with hatred and contempt, anger, fear, and with affective discord rather than affective attunement. So what I want to focus on here is what social psychologists call moral outrage, directed against those seen as violating some kind of moral, social, or political norm. Now, of course, what these norms are, what counts as a violation, are deeply contested. And I want to be clear that moral outrage is an ambivalent emotion. It's not always politically toxic. It may be desirable in many contexts. It can mobilize people by focusing attention and emotional energy on something that is perceived as intolerable or unjust, by channeling action towards remedying it. But the outrage that I'm concerned with here, even though it is articulated and justified in moral terms, is directed against members of a political outgroup, and it's associated with other condemning emotions of anger, contempt, and disgust. It's also associated with a desire to hold others accountable and to punish them, and it shades over easily into abuse and harassment. And when such harassment is sparked by moral outrage, it's often felt to be justified. Now, again, see, there's a familiar theme in my talk. The mobilization of outrage against political opponents is not new. Outrage has been a strategy for capturing attention since the early days of mass circulation newspapers. It was broadcast media that made the mobilization of outrage a recognizable and reliably profitable genre, central to the business model of conservative talk radio in the 1990s and of Fox News in the 2000s. But once again, digital hyperconnectivity has supercharged the production and circulation of moral outrage, and this for three reasons. The first is that the algorithms that govern the circulation of digital content are, of course, optimized for engagement, and moral outrage is distinctively, though not uniquely, engaging. It captures attention both because of the moral framing, since moral stimuli, social psychologists have shown, are more attention-getting, and because of its intense emotionality. So content producers have incentives to generate content that expresses outrage. Incentives to produce engaging content, of course, long preceded hyperconnectivity, but the techniques for monitoring and measuring attention and optimizing content for engagement have become vastly, indeed incomparably more sophisticated in the last decade or so. And the ubiquitous user-facing metrics of social media platforms channel individual contributions in the same direction. Secondly, the superabundance of digital content provides an inexhaustible reservoir of material for anyone who wants to mobilize moral outrage. So a lot of commentary has highlighted the role of fake news or misinformation in fueling outrage, but purveyors of outrage don't need to resort to fabrication. In the hyper-integrated, easily searchable digital media space of a very large country, there's never any shortage of real material. News stories, documents, tweets, TikToks, anything. Real material that non-trivial segments of the population will find outrageous. And I'm obviously not denying the importance of fabrication or misinformation, but the outrage machine does not depend on wholesale invention, even if it does depend on taking things out of context and selective quotation, tendentious framing, and so on. And thirdly, digital communication networks have democratized the production and circulation of moral outrage, just as they have democratized the production of polarized public knowledge. Outrage is no longer simply mobilized from above. It's co-produced from below. One-click convenience enables frictionless participation in ongoing digitally mediated expressions of moral outrage, whether by signing an online petition or commenting on or retweeting or sharing or liking others' expressions of outrage, initiating a chain of moral outrage by posting or commenting on a news story, for example, or characterizing someone's tweet as outrageous is equally convenient and frictionless. So the costs of expressing outrage have plummeted, both because the time and effort required are negligible and because the digital remove from the target reduces the emotional costs of expressing outrage. And the threshold for what is deemed outrageous has declined, allowing for the proliferation of forms of micro outrage. And social media networks not only reduce the costs of expressing moral outrage, they provide new benefits for doing so. They assemble audiences for anyone wishing to broadcast, and they provide immediate, quantified, and highly gratifying social feedback. They thereby provide the perfect environment for what has been called moral grandstanding, that is, for audience-directed moral talk that seeks to enhance one's status within a group or a network. And just as anyone can become a digital micro-celebrity, so anyone can have their own grandstand, since moral grandstanding, like micro-celebrityhood, is defined not by the number of followers one has, but by the fact that one is performing for an audience. Digitally amplified outrage exacerbates polarization. It contributes specifically to reinforcing affective polarization, which is defined by antipathy towards the opposing party. The irony is that social media intensify polarization in important part by exaggerating its extent. So let me unpack that. By contributing to what political scientists have called false polarization, social media end up contributing to real polarization. More precisely, by contributing to false ideological polarization, social media contribute to real affective polarization. Because the voices of outrage on social media platforms are amplified, and they therefore contribute to an exaggerated picture of polarization. They do so because of three factors. The first is our tendency to pay attention to moral and emotional stimuli whenever we scan a social media feed. The second is the fact that algorithms boost the circulation of engaging material. And the third is the fact that people who post frequently on political topics are more partisan and more polarized, more inclined to outrage than others are. So the amplified voices of outrage not only drown out others, they drive out others as more quiet voices alienated by the toxic atmosphere drop out of the discussion. So social media therefore yield a distorted picture of the actual distribution of political views, a picture that represents the public as more deeply divided, more clustered toward the extremes than it actually is. To moderate partisans, this makes the opposing party seem more extreme and threatening, and it can thereby increase antipathy towards that party. So misrepresentations of the degree of polarization are themselves polarizing and can become, to a certain extent, self-fulfilling. Okay, having discussed then the transformations of regimes of knowing and regimes of feeling, I come to regimes of governing. The new ways of governing made possible by digital hyperconnectivity are in many ways antithetical to the new ways of knowing and feeling. So if these new regimes of knowing and feeling are deeply politicized, the new regimes of governing seem at first to be strikingly depoliticized. If the new regimes of knowing and feeling can be described as populist and participatory, the new regimes of governing can be described as technocratic. If the new landscapes of knowing and feeling are unruly and chaotic, the new landscapes of governance seem to be orderly and coordinated and disciplined. These new regimes of governing are data-driven and algorithmically guided. They have been adopted by under-resourced and overburdened government agencies, driven by the availability and the ideological celebration of data, and by promises of objectivity, efficiency, and cost savings. Most public attention has focused on criminal justice and policing applications, so risk scores, for example, guide bail, sentencing, and parole decisions, while predictive policing algorithms channel policing resources toward particular geographic areas or towards persons deemed at risk of committing or becoming the victim of a crime. Predictive algorithms also direct attention to children deemed at risk of abuse and to persons deemed at risk of suicide. Regulatory agencies focus scarce enforcement resources on algorithmically flagged potential violators and so on. But the point I want to underscore here is that algorithmic governance is not restricted to governments. It's in fact much more developed in the private sector, especially by the great tech platforms themselves, because these platforms, after all, have the data, and they have the machine learning expertise to employ much more sophisticated forms of algorithmic governance. Those employed in the public sector are extremely primitive by comparison. And platforms are certainly involved in the business of governing. In the most obvious sense, they govern the behaviors and activities of their users through their design and control of the digital architectures that determine what can be done on any platform. But their governing power extends to public life more broadly. Most crucially, in the domain of politics, they govern who sees what, and therefore, in some measure, who knows what or who believes what, and who feels what. And platforms also govern who can say what in the digital public sphere, right, through content moderation. So private platforms very clearly exercise public functions. Now, governance through data, surveillance, and quantification, of course, has a long history, but algorithmic governance based on machine learning is new. Machine learning requires enormous amounts of data in order to train algorithms, and the data of the requisite magnitude have become routinely available only recently. The data come partly from the digitalization of originally non-digital data, books, images, public records, etc., but they come mainly from the never-resting engines of digital surveillance, which expressly solicit previously undreamt of volumes of data from users, and then, of course, surreptitiously vacuum up traces of all digitally mediated activity. Algorithmic governance is riven by three fundamental tensions. The first is between the claim to objectivity and counterclaims of bias. The ways algorithms can encode and perpetuate bias have become the focus of a lot of research and debate recently. The irony is that algorithmic governance has been promoted precisely as a means of overcoming well-known biases in human decision-making. And this is not just marketing rhetoric. There's evidence that algorithms can indeed be more accurate, consistent, and impartial than human decision-makers in many respects. But of course, algorithms have no God's eye view of the world. What they take account of and how is determined by a series of human choices. And they depend in particular on the data on which they are trained. So to take an oft-noted example, if the historical data used to train predictive policing algorithms reflect racial inequalities in policing, then those inequalities will be carried over into the algorithm in potentially self-reinforcing ways. The second tension I want to highlight is between opacity and transparency. So in democratic settings, it's expected that decisions will be explained and justified. But algorithmic determinations are generally opaque, and it's often difficult, sometimes impossible, to explain or justify them. And opacity may even be necessary to prevent algorithms from being easily gamed. And the final tension is between automaticity and human agency and autonomy. Now, at present, most algorithmic governance systems generate recommendations and they leave human beings to make the decisions. But the algorithms have become more powerful and sophisticated, and as this happens, they've encroached on the space for discretion. And even where algorithms only recommend courses of action, it may become increasingly difficult in practice for humans to override them. So as algorithmic systems become more autonomous, humans risk becoming less so. But it's not just the agency and autonomy of, say, bureaucratic decision makers that are eroded. It's the agency and autonomy of the governed. Automated forms of algorithmic governance are distinctive in being potentially self-enforcing. Not all forms of algorithmic governance are self-enforcing. So for example, algorithmic determinations that prompt interventions by the police or child protection officials are not self-enforcing. The algorithmic determination is one thing. The human intervention, even if it's guided by that algorithmic recommendation, is another. But the algorithmic governance of digitally mediated social action can indeed be self-enforcing. And as more and more of social life becomes digitally mediated, the field of potentially fully automated, self-enforcing governance expands dramatically. As Ori Schwartz has argued, self-enforcing systems of algorithmic governance do not establish rules and then specify penalties for violating them. Rather, digital mediation enables them to preempt violations altogether. And this transforms the very nature of power, which is now generative rather than regulative. So it can directly produce social reality and govern people's conduct from the outside, bypassing rather than seeking to influence their will and consciousness. So for example, gig workers' accounts can be automatically deactivated if their rating falls below a certain level. Or a car could be remotely disabled if the owner falls behind on payments, right? And those actions can be taken without any human intermediation whatsoever. They can be fully automated. Now, perhaps the most important site for potentially fully automated, self-enforcing algorithmic governance in the near future is content moderation on digital platforms. This has become much more automated in the last few years as a result of advances in machine learning, and the challenge of the early phase of the pandemic when human moderators were sent home, also the intensifying demands for platforms to intervene more aggressively against hate speech, bullying, terrorism, pornography, misinformation, copyright infringement, and so on. Now, until recently, humans had been playing two key roles in content moderation systems. The unpaid labor of social media users has been mobilized to flag potentially problematic content, and then armies of poorly paid workers have been hired to review the flagged content and make decisions on removal. But algorithms have been displacing humans on both of these fronts. So the vast majority of content determined to be in violation of Facebook's policies is now discovered by algorithms before it is flagged by any user, and an increasing share of this algorithmically flagged content is also algorithmically removed without human review. And of course, further moves in this direction are likely, both because of the economic and the human costs of having human operators review enormous quantities of disturbing material, and because with every determination they make, the human moderators are in effect training algorithms to replace them. So in a world of more fully automated content moderation, private platforms will wield enormous, concentrated, opaque, and largely unaccountable algorithmic power over all platform-mediated speech, public and private. Unlike human moderators, whose attention is limited, algorithms can scrutinize all content. And as automated content moderation comes to be taken for granted as part of the basic infrastructure of platform-mediated communication, the ultimately political nature of definitions, say, of terrorism or hate speech or bullying and so on, risks being hidden beneath a patina of machine-guaranteed objectivity. Now, the technocratic quality of the new regimes of algorithmic governance, as I suggested, is sharply opposed to the populist, participatory, and politicized character of the new regimes of knowing and feeling. So I want to conclude with a few broader remarks about the ways hyperconnectivity can promote both populism and its seeming antithesis, technocracy. I'll start with populism. Digital hyperconnectivity accentuates the chronic populism of late modern societies in two main ways. First, it's a technology and an ideology of immediacy. By circumventing or disrupting institutional intermediaries of all kinds, hyperconnectivity promises to connect people directly to news and information, audiences directly to creators, citizens directly to political leaders. Now, complete disintermediation is, of course, a myth. Hyperconnectivity simply replaces visible intermediaries with what you could call self-invisibilizing ones. Digital platforms remain intermediaries even when they disavow that role and present themselves instead as neutral conduits and facilitators. But the promise of immediacy is not entirely illusory, right? The bypassing or weakening of existing intermediaries is a real and important social process. Digitally mediated communications can feel direct and immediate, and Donald Trump's connection with his legions of Twitter followers was more direct and immediate than the usually institutionally mediated and filtered connections between politicians and citizens. Citizens' relation to public knowledge claims, although algorithmically filtered, is also indeed more immediate than it was when public knowledge was primarily organized in the US, say, by 3 major American television networks or by a single state broadcaster in some other countries. The ideology of disintermediation is powerfully attractive, and it's precisely a populist ideology. For populism is itself an ideology of immediacy. It promises to empower ordinary people by disempowering mediating institutions and the elites that appear so comfortably ensconced in them. So in the political sphere, populism delegitimizes intermediating institutions like political parties, professional expertise, courts, the mainstream media, and it demands an immediate or direct relation between the people and the exercise of power. So there's a deep homology between the logic of digital hyperconnectivity as a technology of disintermediation and the logic of populism as an ideology of immediacy. Hyperconnectivity, you could even say, delivers, in a sense, one key part of what populism demands. It bypasses or weakens mediating institutions, and it connects people directly, or at least it seems to connect them directly to news and information, to cultural products, and to political leaders. Now, the second way in which hyperconnectivity fosters populism is by contributing to the popularization of culture and politics. It does so, in one sense, by opening up more accessible and engaging forms of cultural and political participation and broadening the range of participants. So digital platforms have made it much easier for those outside the cultural or political mainstream, including the disaffected citizens to whom populist politicians often appeal, to find like-minded others and establish a public presence. Hyperconnectivity contributes to popularization in a second sense by making calculations of popularity more central to culture and to politics. So technologies of continuous and granular quantification make popular preferences and beliefs visible in new ways. Ubiquitous trending algorithms, for example, don't just register what is popular for a particular public at a particular moment. They amplify and reinforce the popularity that they register by feeding it back into the system. The digitally networked public sphere thus enshrines popularity as the ultimate arbiter of value. And hyperconnectivity contributes to popularization in a final sense by strongly favoring popular cultural and political styles, that is, low styles rather than high styles. Low styles are attention-seeking and taboo-breaking. They flout the constraints and restraints of polite speech and political correctness. They incline towards confrontation, emotionalization, personalization, hypersimplification. Now, of course, such low styles were already favored by the pre-digital mediatization of politics in the age of television, but they are even more strongly favored in the highly competitive digital attention economy and in what you might call the attention polity. They have the best chance for gaining traction by breaking through the glut of superabundant digital content. So the ecology of hyperconnectivity has deep affinities with the logic of populism. In the cultural domain, it erodes the power of gatekeepers, engenders new forms of popular creativity, and universalizes metrics that record and amplify popularity. In the political sphere, it allows ordinary people, disaffected citizens in particular, to be addressed directly. It facilitates the emergence of counterpublics, and it rewards the low political styles that are best suited to mobilizing against the establishment. But at the same time, the new modes of algorithmic governance enabled by hyperconnectivity are deeply technocratic. Algorithmic governance is premised on specialized knowledge, specifically on the knowledge generated by complex computational procedures that analyze large volumes of data. The justification for entrusting decision-making to such procedures is that the knowledge they generate and their capacity to find optimal solutions for precisely defined problems is superior to the knowledge and optimizing capabilities of even the most highly trained humans. Now, technocratic ideals also underlie and animate the broader spirit of what Yevgeny Morozov calls technological solutionism. Solutionist thinking, like technocracy in general, is depoliticizing. It seeks to transform social and political problems into technical problems. It thus exemplifies the assimilation of politics to engineering that Michael Oakeshott saw as characteristic of rationalist politics in general. Now, usually, technocracy and populism are understood as antithetical. While technocracy entrusts decision-making power to experts or to expert-designed knowledge procedures like algorithms, populism distrusts the claims of expertise in politics. And while technocracy is depoliticizing, seeking to insulate decision-making from popular interference, populism is generally repoliticizing. It claims to reassert political control over issues that are seen as having been illegitimately removed from the domain of democratic decision-making and entrusted to unaccountable bureaucrats, experts, or to courts. As decision-making by unaccountable algorithms and by the unaccountable platforms and experts that design them becomes increasingly important, then you might expect it to become vulnerable to populist challenge. But there are reasons to think that algorithmic governance may remain insulated from such challenge. Content moderation on major platforms became more automated and more visible, more intrusive during the pandemic, during and after the US 2020 election, but this did prompt user complaints about censorship and liberal bias, but it did not generate a populist challenge to content moderation per se. Algorithms are not only unaccountable, in a certain sense, they're unaddressable. So unlike courts or bureaucratic agencies or expert panels that publish their rulings and recommendations, algorithms don't make easy targets, right? They're self-invisibilizing. They're protected by their opacity. They're protected also by the fact that they work in a granular, case-specific manner. Algorithmic governance has, of course, become an important focus of contestation, but that contestation is carried out in a technical idiom. Specialized knowledge of algorithms is required in order to contest the specialized knowledge encoded in algorithms. More fundamentally, and I conclude with this point, as Christopher Bickerton and Carlo Invernizzi-Accetti have argued, the reciprocal antagonism of populism and technocracy conceals an underlying affinity. Both are opposed to the complex and messy mediations of party democracy. As the structural foundations of party democracy have eroded in the last half-century, political competition has come to be structured increasingly by what they call a techno-populist political logic, characterized by conjoined appeals to the people on the one hand and to problem-solving competence on the other. Now, Bickerton and Invernizzi-Accetti are not concerned with the new communication technologies. The techno, in their techno-populism, refers to technocracy, not to technology. But hyperconnectivity powerfully reinforces the synthesis of populism and technocracy that they describe. As a technology and an ideology of immediacy, it exacerbates the very crisis of institutional mediation to which it claims to respond. It contributes in particular to the hollowing out of parties and of the press as mediating institutions. As a technology of the popular, hyperconnectivity generates new ways of mobilizing, consulting, and measuring the people, and new ways of claiming to act on their behalf. And as a technology of knowledge, hyperconnectivity affords new ways of knowing and governing the social world, new ways of recasting social problems as technical problems. If techno-populist appeals to the people and to expertise increasingly structure our politics and shape our experience of democracy, as Bickerton and Invernizzi-Accetti argue in the final sentence of their book, hyperconnectivity increasingly structures and shapes both appeals to the people and appeals to expertise. So the techno in techno-populism may thus indeed refer to technology as well as to technocracy. Thank you.
project. Thank you very much for that. Look, I'll be honest. At the beginning, you said that you didn't want to sort of pile on the doom mongering. That you know, there are good things, there are bad things, and so on. But frankly, I'm struggling to see the optimistic here. So perhaps you could help me.
No, fair enough. No, look, I'm temperamentally pessimistic, so I'm afraid I really can't help you out so much there. I guess, but what I wanted to do is just kind of reframe the discussion. Yes, of course, it's a pessimistic view. I wanted, though, to reframe the discussion away from the usual focus on things like misinformation and so on, and just kind of look at it from a somewhat different angle, even if it ends up being a rather a gloomy take.
Yep. So. Is there any way, I'm struck by, at the end, what you were talking about. We have this dichotomy of human agency and machine agency. On the one hand, human oversight over machines is surely desirable. And yet, if you take something like the platform formerly known as Twitter, then the owner of Twitter is going to be able to manage those algorithms in a way which is perhaps even more damaging than if you had algorithms which were generated from a broader spectrum of data. Is the answer to this, or at least is one of the things that you would advocate, greater human oversight and agency over technocratic forms of governance, or is that human agency per se flawed when combined with algorithmic instructions?
I mean, in terms of advocacy, I guess I would not so much frame this in terms of human versus, agency, but rather in terms of greater public oversight over private power when that private power is exercising essentially public functions, as is, I think, clearly the case. I mean, our public discourse rules are set by unaccountable private corporation. Now, obviously, I don't think you should have, the infamous Ministry of Truth to kind of monitor. I totally would reject that, but nonetheless, I don't have any specific proposals here. It's not my field, but recognizing the public nature of what private platforms do in every sphere of life. I mean, it could be private platforms that are increasingly designing education systems, are increasingly involved in transportation or food or medicine, or as well as communication and so on. Recognizing that this is our public life, right? Our public life is increasingly governed by private platforms, and that seems to me the central an insight which simply hasn't been acted on to a sufficient degree.
And those private platforms, in that case, is the concentration of power into about 5 or 6 major corporations, all of them at the moment, although there's competition from other parts of the world, located down the west coast of the United States. Do you think that addressing that monopoly of power, i.e. an antitrust approach to what's going on, might alter the landscape of social media and other platforms that you described in the talk?
Certainly, I think that's possible, and I think it was interesting that, it seems there's some shift in the Republican Party sense, but it was interesting that this was one domain of considerable amount of bipartisan agreement in recent years of supporting a more aggressive antitrust stance. We'll see what happens now, but I absolutely think this is a crucial weapon, yes, because traditional criteria for antitrust regulation in the last decades were focused on price issues and so on, but there's been a revival in the context of hyperconnectivity of a so-called neo-Brandeisian approach that sees bigness itself as a problem. And of course, Lena Khan's role has been important here. So yes, I think that's an important public policy instrument.
Now, about sort of 7 or 8 years ago, there was, perhaps now about 10 years ago, there was the movement Internet 3.0, which sought to distribute data, to find new ways of data distribution and data storage, taking it out of the hands of corporations and into the hands of broad collectives of individuals. That appeared, there was quite some excitement about that for about 2 or 3 years, and then it just seemed to fall away. Is that a new distribution system of data another feasible way of addressing some of the problems that you've highlighted in the talk?
Well, the technical infrastructure underlying various Web 3.0 ideals typically involves blockchain stuff, and of course that's central to crypto and all of that. So I tend to think that the whole discourse, the whole Web 3.0 discourse, while it used a kind of populist or pseudo-populist language about decentralization. About it was an anti-platform language and so on. I think this was done fairly cynically, and it's been very clear that what has emerged in the landscape of blockchain-built stuff, crypto and other things, have been precisely new intermediaries. The rhetoric is no intermediaries, but the reality is new intermediaries and new organizations, even in the crypto field. So I'm very skeptical of that rhetoric of democracy, decentralization, distribution, and so on.
Yeah. So I'm struggling here because I'm trying to find a sort of, we seem to be on a path of almost sort of social self-destruction, and you mentioned generative AIs. You also mentioned the issue of abundance and scale. Are we reaching a stage where actually our agency is irrelevant to the way that public discourse and public action is ordered?
Oh, I wouldn't go that far, and I think the steps that Europe has taken in the regulatory domain are quite significant. I think things that could be done in the growing out of the lawsuits that are working their way through the courts in the U.S. In the antitrust domain are significant. No, I don't. And you see, of course, agency of a different kind exerted in China. Very strong state control over the tech sector, and I don't even speak to the question that lurks kind of behind your comment. Because I'm not an AI student about whatever the singularity and all that. I don't even go near that part of the question. But no, I don't think it would be helpful to say that there is no agency.
Right. Okay, so there is agency still, and what you're suggesting is agency through relatively traditional mechanisms of government. So basically a regulatory regime which will alter the direction of power and communications.
I mean, I think that has to be one element. I would like to think, though, that we also need a different kind of public discourse where people recognize, the multi-tentacular nature of the platform society that has emerging. So in my own field, in the educational sector or something, it would be helpful just if there could be a little bit more skepticism towards what Morozov calls techno-solutionism, skepticism towards the idea that the solution to any problem is kind of a new platform. I mean, I just think a more generalized public discussion about platformization and its limits, its threats, demystifying this rhetoric of that somehow all of our solutions will be solved by a more efficient. I mean, you would think there would be an accumulating public experience of the discontents of platformization in various spheres. When people see, for example, I don't know that you can't call a cab because Uber has destroyed the cab system and taxi system in your local, or you can't find. There's no more hardware stores in your neighborhood because everything, because each of us has contributed to increasing the strength of Amazon, click by convenient click, repeated 1 trillion times. So I just, I would hope that there would be, a little bit more of a discursive shift here. And I think you saw some of that before the pandemic. I do think it was unfortunate that in the pandemic, the great tech platforms kind of recovered some of their prestige and positioned themselves as techno-philanthropists who were in a position, for example, to give away hundreds of millions of dollars of equipment to schools so that instruction could continue and so on. So I think there was more momentum. There was a kind of emerging, more serious tech critique just before the pandemic. But I think that kind of critique needs to be developed.
Yes, I've noticed. I mean, that in the tech world there is, and indeed amongst a lot of politicians as well, there's an obsession with innovation. That innovation must be per se good, and so one goes ahead and deploys new technologies before the implications of those new technologies have been examined in any way, shape or form.
Completely. You move fast and break things, and then, yeah, absolutely.
Yep. Okay, well, I'm going to throw it over to the audience, and I've got my wrong glasses today, so I can't see people. So if I don't know who you are, it's not because I don't recognize you. So.
Introduce ourselves, or?
Yes, please do introduce yourselves. Yeah.
Good evening, John Hennon-Fent. I'm a trade and antitrust lawyer here in Vienna. I thought it was a remarkable talk, a lot of substance, so I'm glad I made it tonight. One critique and then one just suggestion for maybe further exploration on this topic for you, Rogers. The critique is, you talked about algorithmic governance in the private sector, how they are somewhat immune from public pressure because they are not so out front. That's a bad paraphrase, but you made remarks in that direction. I can't help but be reminded of why Elon Musk bought Twitter, which was the Hunter Biden laptop suppression story, which was called Russian disinformation at the time. You also have the Cambridge, and Dorsey was called to testify before Congress, and this was probably decisive in why Musk bought the platform in the end. You also have the Cambridge Analytica Facebook issues in 2016, which got a lot of attention in that aftermath of Trump's election. You also have a lot of focus, particularly on the left, towards algorithms around policing and anti-terrorism and the dangers there for these becoming racialized and so on. So there is, I think, a good amount of attention on the private platforms. And then suggestions for further research or exploration, which is on the antitrust front. We did mention China briefly. We have oversight of these platforms in the West. We have constitutional rights and so on that allow us to have those rights embedded. Twitter, Facebook, et cetera, they can't violate the US Constitution. They can't violate the the EU Treaty on Human Rights and so on and so on. If we start removing our tech power, of course, other companies are going to step into the vacuum. Are those constitutional rights, those companies aren't going to be required to abide by those. And so I just want to bring that to the attention of the neo-Brandeisians. I think there's something to their critique, but I think they miss something important as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I mean, those are good points. I guess I wasn't, and it's true that my point in talking about the tech platforms and content moderation was just to note that the tendencies are moving towards more fully automated systems, and I just wanted to use that as a way of illustrating this potentiality for a new kind of exercise of power. You're absolutely right that platforms were coming under pressure for the reasons you suggested. But it's just, this is something conceptually new, a kind of power that can be exercised in a very different model than the kind of power that's exercised when you make a rule, then someone can violate it or not violate, and then you punish them. This is a kind of power that can prevent things from being done. I'm not picking on any particular platform here. I'm just saying, a platform can just literally prevent certain things from happening, right? And that, I think, we have to get used to thinking about that new kind of power that doesn't work through the mediation of human consciousness. That was my argument in that part.
Thank you. I have an analogy which can we wait till you get a microphone?
Okay. Sorry.
That's true, but no one else can.
So, my name is just Eugen Spanocchi, and I'm I work in the private business, so I'm no member of any university. But the analogy which I have in mind is the fear of the Catholic Church against the printing of books. Yeah, it was just the same arguments. Yeah, that the institutions are disempowered. Everybody can read a book, or even if he collects some money, he can print a book. Yeah, and there was a great fear about this chaos and the loss of the power of institutions. And I think if you look at the history in a long way, it's always a progress to more and more autonomy of the individuals. And less power of the kings and politicians and institutions. So that's just what happens now, that we have incredible many individuals who can who can put their voice into the internet. So I don't see any fear that this will be unified. If you look into the internet, you know that everybody can put some small opinion into the internet, and he thinks he's not the star. Oh, why not? Yeah. So I don't know why he was. That's the way of progress of technology. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, I can't agree that. I don't think this is a universal law of history. I think your point about the disruptive aspects of print technology is absolutely correct. I think that, of course, it took a couple of 100 years for that incredible, disruptive, powerful effects of that new technology to work their way through social life. And obviously, things are happening much faster now. They happen much faster with radio and television. They're happening even faster now. But I guess I don't agree on this point about a trend towards increasing autonomy. I think there was a lot of internet-related utopianism in its early days, maybe 30 years ago, with people talking about this incredibly decentralized architecture, and that was really the case. It was true, but that is not. It's simply the entire architecture has changed in fundamental ways, and the concentrations of power are so immense that I just cannot see that it's a plausible story to tell about continued disempowering of any kind of institution. Some institutions, of course, this was part of my argument, that various intermediary institutions, legacy, media, political parties, and so on, are profoundly disempowered. And yet the assemblage of power by the great tech platforms themselves is, I think, unparalleled in human history. So I can't agree with that long-term trajectory that you suggested.
There's one over there, I think.
Okay. Yeah, I'm Francesco Striano. I'm a junior fellow here in the Digital Humanism program. And first of all, I have to really thank you for this lecture. And this is not academic politeness, and so, because just to give you an idea on how much this lecture resonates to me, I want just to say that I recently worked about agency, trust, transparency, disintermediation, crisis of experience, expertise. My last book was about digital mediated violence. My upcoming book will be about regime of visibility and how interfaces and technology affect human perception, attention, and predisposition to action. So I would have a lot of questions, but I will limit myself to one very, very small issue about the regime of knowing. You speak at the beginning of the lecture, because I'm curious, I want to ask if you make like a qualitative distinction between information and misinformation, and especially if you consider like a difference in epistemic access to information regarding two groups of people. I mean, there is a difference in epistemic access from a group of people that believes in experts and group of people that believes in conspiracy theories, say. So there is a question of competence that permit to discriminate between information and misinformation, or there is just knowledge for by testimony, and arbitrarily arbitrarily or for personal reasons, someone decided to believe and to trust experts or to trust conspiracy theorists. I mean, which one position you will more akin to take?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite get the question. So you're saying that
yeah, I asked if there is like a question, like an issue of competence. So a group of people is more competent in discriminating between information and misinformation, or there are just other reasons why some people believes to experts and some people believes to conspiracy theorists.
Right. I mean, of course, I think there are differences in competence in certain areas, but of course there are also, and this is part of the problem, there are also conflicting understandings of what constitutes competence in some cases. And I think some of the interesting work on conspiracy theories has, because of course that's a contested category, and your conspiracy theory may be my, plausible story. I think some of the interesting work on conspiracy theories tries to bracket, some of the interesting sociological work tries to bracket the question of, truth or falsehood, and tries to just describe the practices, describe the knowledge practices. And I find that kind of line of work quite interesting, rather than just using conspiracy as a kind of cudgel to beat down your opponents, right? Trying to describe the epistemic practices that, there's one very brilliant article on this that was about QAnon. What are the scriptural practices? How are they modeled on biblical interpretation in some cases? What forms of local expertise are cultivated within a certain community? I think it's important to study those kinds of epistemic practices to see how new kinds of epistemic practices are possible in this new ecology of knowledge and so on. And then you see, indeed, there are conflicting claims to there are local forms of expertise, indeed, which are recognized within that community and so on. So I think that's an important kind of sociological work to do. But of course, does that mean I don't think there are, differences in competence? Of course I do, but I think it's also important to study the production of local forms of expertise and local claims to competence as a way of countering earlier kind of notions. I think they're not so widespread anymore, but the kind of notion that, well, it's just post-truth and nobody cares. No, or no one cares about evidence. No, people care about evidence a lot, even in these, what you might call conspiratorial milieu, but they have specific practices for assessing evidence and what counts as evidence and so on. And I think it's important to attend to those kinds of practices and to those kinds of claims.
Michael.
Michael Ignatieff, CEU. Rogers, I wanted to ask whether the analysis of epistemic authority needs to get a little sharper in your account, because there's a risk that you're saying digital hyperconnectivity is basically flattening, destroying, overturning epistemic authority. And yet when I look at so I wanted you to be more precise about where the threat to epistemic authority is really happening. I work at a university. Universities around the world are still doing what they've done for 1,000 years. You're a very distinguished professor of sociology at UCLA, and you want that authority designated on this thing for very good reasons. You have the authority of your office, you have the authority of a life's work. This place is called the Institute for Human Sciences, and this isn't just branding, for God's sake. You've been at this for 30, 40 years. When I open my phone, I don't see epistemic chaos at all. What I see is curated journalism that I pay for, that has a very good record in distinguishing between facts and fiction, and it has epistemic authority with me and with the million other subscribers who enlist in it. And why do we subscribe? Because it has epistemic authority, and our subscription base reproduces their capacity to reproduce their epistemic authority. So it's a fascinating talk, but I wanted you to be a little more precise about whose epistemic authority is being lost here precisely. I feel the challenge. I feel the challenge in my own classroom. I feel the challenge every day. But the towers have not toppled, in my view. They're still standing. So we need to have a better sociology of the power impact of digital hyperconnectivity than I think you gave us tonight.
Yes, very good question, Michael. Thank you. Of course, I think you're absolutely right. But okay, the Times has been very successful in a digital environment and has whatever is 2 million paid subscriptions and so. But it's a big community. I'm part of it. But it is still, it is in a sense a big bubble, right? I mean, if you look at survey data on trust in media, it's not encouraging. And so I do think that, yes, how do institutions work? There's mutual self-recognition, and all the subscribers will kind of recognize one another, and we recognize that authority. But outside of our it's a big bubble, but it's still a bubble. I think it's troubling that. I don't know if there's survey data specifically on confidence about the New York Times or trust in the New York Times, but there, of course, is on mainstream media institutions. And the data are not pretty at all. But you're right. You're absolutely right that one needs a much more nuanced account than I was able to give here. And I appreciate your formulation of the problem.
If I may just chip in there, Michael, I mean, in the media world, we are seeing the towers crumbling in various places. If you look, for example, at local media, local media has been more or less destroyed by the internet, and this is very damaging for democracy on a micro level. And I don't think that's necessarily going to stop with local media. It may still go further. I mean, the signs are there. So whilst we still pay for our epistemic knowledge, lots of people don't. And I would say that is probably on the increase rather than on the decrease.
Thank you. Yes, a very important point about that.
Questions? We're almost done, but we've got time for another question. There's a hand at the back, I see. Oh, one at the back, one at the front. But we'll start at the back.
Thank you so much. My name is Camila. I'm a PhD candidate in the history department at Princeton. I happen to come from a region in Moldova where we are united through generations through watching Russian TV, a specific Russian TV channel, First Channel, do not recommend. But my grandparents watched that channel, my parents watched that channel, I grew up watching that channel. And it took me a lot of graduate degrees to stop thinking that, topless Putin on a bear is not the greatest thing the world has ever seen. So I have a question, and now, whenever I happen to go back home, I see that people, including my classmates, people my age, continue watching that channel and trusting that channel above all else, regardless of the fact that there are other news media. And I wonder if that's like an extremely anecdotal case, or if you see any other cases where certain groups of people or contexts remain immune to hyperconnectivity, and what could explain that, and if there is a certain kind of danger in that as well. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's interesting, your observation that if I understood you correctly, even your people your age or young people, that's still the case for, because typically I think one would expect that might be true in, I don't know, my sense is, say, in villages in Hungary, the older generation, yes, that they're really much more oriented to the legacy media, to television and so on, and not to digital channels. But younger people everywhere, people more in cities, are more oriented to. So I'd be curious about the generational differences in your case. But I guess I mean, of course, if you receive all of your information from one channel, then that's extremely limited. So yes, that is a complementary danger. But I don't think the solution to it then is simply all the unfiltered stuff on the internet. But I appreciate your comment, and it's an interesting case.
And here at the front.
Pays off. Thank you. My name is Gregor Rosenauer. I'm a software engineer with a humanist background, actually, a strange combination maybe. But thanks to this institution, not anymore. Thank you. I want to circle back to the topic of decentralization, because we only spoke about Web 3.0, which is very hypey. Before AI, it was blockchain and Web 3.0. But there's also the Fediverse, and there was a time when a lot of people thought about leaving Twitter. Didn't turn out in the end as such a competition, but it's still there, and it's interesting to see that it's completely different in structure, because it's federated. It's also disconnected in a way. There are several servers with topics. And I see a big chance here, because you cannot simply flood a federated zone with shite. But on the other hand, it could actually make the situation worse, because then you have these topic islands, and people actually attach to their bubbles. And so what is, is it, do you see this optimistic or pessimistic, or what's your?
Yeah, I mean, I thank you. I think it was indeed interesting when, in the early days of Musk's Twitter, there was all this talk about, everyone's going to leave, everyone's going to, and I guess it was a coordination problem, but it didn't happen at all. Really, it's quite remarkable, and so I do think that trying to imagine alternative structures for digital platforms is important. And I'm not an expert here, but a lot of people are enthusiasts about Discord, that kind of thing. So I think there's a political scientist I admire, Kevin Munger, who's written a lot about this, and I think so. Yes, I think that within a properly chastened way, there were a lot of a generation ago, tremendous amount of enthusiasm about digital democracy, and I think that was all very, very it looks all very naive in retrospect. But that doesn't mean that design issues aren't important. Design issues are very important. And maybe design, just one example, for example, even within Twitter or Facebook or something, there's been a persuasive arguments that when Twitter introduced the retweet function, that changed the discursive landscape in a significant way. So design choices matter. Things that could reduce friction, reduce the velocity of circulation, I guess I'm not that optimistic about structural features that can actually promote deliberation. I think, so there's interesting work done on the digital public sphere that stresses its reactive nature and plebiscitarian nature, how one could build in spaces for deliberation. That's more complicated, but it's a necessary task, absolutely.
Do we have any final question? Yes, we do, at the back.
Thank you. Paula Diehl, I'm professor for political theory History of Ideas and Political Culture in the University of Kiel. Rogers, thank you so much for bringing up the positive side of it. I was trying to find an example, and I'm not so sure if my example is a positive one. I was thinking about the 5-star movement in the beginning, before they launched the platform Rousseau. And everything was centered in the blog of Beppe Grillo. But people had a lot of liberty to connecting and having very different discussions in this blog, right? And it came from time to time to situations where activists challenged Grillo in his decision. So there are a lot of crises going on before they establish an institutional platform, because people could join that, but it could also leave the platform without consequences. Would you see a form of positive interconnectivity, or would you say it's not in interconnectivity at all? How do you explain this kind of example? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Paula. I mean, I'm sure you know the work of Gerbaudo on the digital party, and you know there was I think you're right about, to the extent that I know anything about it, about the early days of this platform, the Beppe Grillo blog. But it does seem that, you know, ultimately somebody, you know, the people who provide the structure, the infrastructure in this case, the guy behind the, you know, they control the structure, and they can, if they decide that, okay, yeah, the way it's set up now, it allows for lots of, you know, but they decide they want to tighten it, or they decide they want to, you know, move in a more plebiscitarian direction, as convincingly has been shown was the case for Podemos, that, you know, the ideal of digital democracy was used to basically empower leaders and cut out party activists in the middle by using the rhetoric of democratization and immediacy and so on, but basically just by enabling those who controlled the party structure to say, okay, we're going to solicit popular input only in this plebiscitarian form, and we'll put the questions, we'll decide which questions to put, and you can say yes or no. You know, so I mean, yes, I'm sure there are alternative forms, but it's too easy for those who control the structures, in this case the software, to design it in such a way that promotes their own interests. But yes, I think that's thank you for suggesting that example.
Rogers, thank you very much. I mean, I'm particularly grateful to you for the way that you're framing this. Because it makes it really does make understanding what is going on, when we all feel quite overwhelmed by our own personal experiences and interaction in the digital world. It really helps to start breaking it down and see what is actually going on, both with ourselves and with other people, and how we're coming together and not coming together. So I thought that was an absolutely terrific lecture. Thank you so much for giving it here at the Institute for Human Sciences. And to everyone here, unfortunately not people watching on YouTube, or other platforms are available, I would like to invite you now to come down and have some wine and cheese. Thank you very much. Before a huge round of applause.